Today is December 23rd. It's the 358th day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. Born on this day in 1923, Navy pilot, Medal of Honor recipient, and vice presidential candidate, Vice Admiral James Stockdale. Stockdale is born James Bond Stockdale in Abingdon, Illinois. He graduates from the Naval Academy in 1946 and completes flight training in 1950. In 1954, he's accepted into the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, and after graduation serves as a test pilot until the late 1950s, when the Navy sends him to get a master's degree at Stanford. He studies philosophy, particularly the Enchiridion, the writings of the Roman slave philosopher Epictetus, the Stoic. Years later, when he is held captive as a prisoner of war, Stockdale meditates on the work of Epictetus, who taught that the epitome of evil is not death, but the fear of death. Stockdale's path to the prison hell known as the Hanoi Hilton starts when he is on patrol in his fighter jet over the Tonkin Gulf in August 1964. He is witness to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an engagement with enemy Vietnamese forces that never was. Stockdale, one of the pilots on patrol that night in 1964, later recalls that he has the best seat in the house for the event. Quote, "Our destroyers were just shooting up phantom targets. There were no enemy PT boats there. There was nothing there but black water and American firepower." This is the so-called attack on American forces that President Johnson uses as justification to begin bombing Vietnam the next day. And Stockdale is tasked to lead the first bombing mission of the Vietnam War. 1 year later in 1965, he's on a mission over North Vietnam when his A-4 Skyhawk is hit by enemy fire. He ejects and parachutes into a small village where he's taken prisoner. Stockdale will be held in the Hoa Lo prison, the Hanoi Hilton, for the next 7.5 years. James Stockdale is a leader among the prisoners, and a leader of the POW's resistance to interrogation. When he learns he will be paraded in public for propaganda purposes, he cuts his scalp with a razor to disfigure himself. The prison guards cover his head with a hat, so he beats himself in the face with a stool until his face is swollen and unrecognizable. According to his Medal of Honor citation, quote, "Rear Admiral Stockdale was singled out for interrogation and attendant torture after he was detected in a covert communications attempt, sensing the start of another purge and aware that his earlier efforts at self-disfiguration to dissuade his captors from exploiting him for propaganda purposes had resulted in cruel and agonizing punishment. Rear Admiral Stockdale resolved to make himself a symbol of resistance regardless of personal sacrifice. He deliberately inflicted a near-mortal wound to his person. He cuts his wrists, in order to convince his captors of his willingness to give up his life rather than capitulate. He was subsequently discovered and revived by the North Vietnamese who, convinced of his indomitable spirit, abated in their employment of excessive harassment and torture toward all of the prisoners of war. Admiral Stockdale is released as a prisoner of war in 1973, but not before his captors dislocate his shoulders, shatter his leg, and break his back. After recovering from his wounds, he is named president of the Citadel Military College in South Carolina in the 1970s, and he's made a fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in the 1980s. In 1992, independent presidential candidate Ross Perot selects Admiral Stockdale as his provisional vice presidential nominee. Perot plans to replace Stockdale before the election, but then Perot drops out of the race and gets back in the race and never gets around to choosing another running mate. Stockdale is notified he will be participating in the vice presidential debate against Dan Quayle and Al Gore just a week before the debate. He's given no debate prep or any background on Perot's stance on political issues. Nonetheless, Stockdale steps up to the podium. When asked for an opening statement by the moderator, Stockdale begins to introduce himself by saying,
"Who am I? Why am I here? I'm not a politician, everybody knows that, so don't expect me to use the language of the Washington Insider. 37 years in the Navy, and only one of them up there in Washington. And now I'm an academic."
His debate performance lacks focus, and he appears out of his element. But can you blame him? Not many people would have the courage to take the stage at a nationally televised debate with 1 week's notice and zero preparation. After the vice presidential debate, he is the butt of jokes by late-night talk show hosts, and is particularly skewered by Saturday Night Live. Cast member Phil Hartman plays Stockdale as a dim-witted, doddering old fool. And this is how most Americans come to know Admiral James Stockdale. Perot and Stockdale lose the 1992 election, and though they take no states, they receive an historic 19% of the vote, in comparison to Bill Clinton's 43% of the vote, with 350 electoral votes. Vice Admiral James Stockdale, born on this day in 1923, retires to Coronado, California, and passes away in 2005 at the age of 81. Quote, "By his heroic action, at great peril to himself, he earned the everlasting gratitude of his fellow prisoners and of his country. Admiral Stockdale's valiant leadership and extraordinary courage in a hostile environment sustain and enhance the finest traditions of the U.S. Naval Service." There are 8 days left in the year. On This Day is produced by me, Dave Schultz. Thank you very much for listening. It's the second day of the 10 Days of On This Day podcast, revisiting my favorite episodes from the past year. A lot of them come from October. It was a great month for stories. Today I'll tweet and beak out the October 29th episode featuring artist Bob Ross. Check it out on Twitter at OnThisDayPod, again that's at OnThisDayPod, or Facebook/OnThisDayPodcast. And if you're still listening, stay tuned for the On This Day podcast end-of-year fire safety tips. Talk to you tomorrow.